It was a warm evening in the city, the kind of evening when people returned from work, the air buzzing with traffic and conversation. Federal Judge David Turner had just finished a long day at the courthouse. His cases were heavy that week, filled with complicated arguments, but he always carried himself with calm and fairness. After leaving his chambers, he decided to drive himself home rather than let the court car take him. He enjoyed driving alone sometimes, using the quiet road to think about the day and to clear his mind. David was a tall man in his late 50s, dressed in simple clothes that evening. He was not wearing his usual robe or the suit he wore in court. To anyone on the street, he looked like an ordinary man. His car was a modest, dark sedan, not a luxury vehicle, and it blended in with the rest of the traffic. He had always lived with humility despite his high position. For him, respect was not earned through expensive clothes or flashy cars, but through actions and character. As he drove through a quiet neighborhood near the courthouse, the red and blue lights of a police car suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. David gently slowed his car and pulled to the side of the road. He wondered why they had stopped him. He checked his speed. It had been within the limit. His seatbelt was on. The car was well maintained. He took a deep breath and waited as the police car stopped behind him. He did not feel nervous at first. Like most citizens, he thought this was just a routine stop that would be over in a few minutes. Two officers stepped out of the car. The lead officer, a tall man with sharp features, placed one hand on his belt and approached with a heavy walk. The second officer, younger and quieter, followed closely. David rolled down his window and waited with calm patience. The officer leaned down and shined a flashlight into the car, though the sun had not completely set yet. His eyes scanned the inside of the vehicle, then fixed on David. "License and registration," the officer said in a cold, clipped tone. David nodded politely and handed over his documents. He spoke in his usual calm voice. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer did not answer directly. Instead, he glanced at the registration card and then back at David, his face carrying suspicion. "Broken taillight," he said, though David knew both taillights were fine. He had checked his car that very morning. David decided not to argue. He had seen too many cases where arguments with police only escalated matters. He thought it would be better to stay calm. The officer studied David longer than necessary. "Where are you headed?" he asked. David replied simply, "I'm heading home." The officer's tone grew harder. "Home? And where's that?" David gave his address. The officer's eyes narrowed as if testing his answer. David noticed the tension building in the man's voice, and for the first time, he felt something was off. This was not a normal traffic stop. It was clear the officer was looking for reasons, not explanations. The second officer walked slowly around the car, shining his light along the sides and peering through the windows. His steps were deliberate, like he was expecting to find something wrong. David kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, every movement slow and respectful. He had studied countless cases of misuse of authority. Now he was living one. "Step out of the car," the lead officer suddenly ordered. David looked at him carefully. "Officer, may I ask why?" The officer's hand rested on his holster now, his voice sharper. "Step out of the car, now." David unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. He stood tall, his posture calm but firm. He tried to keep his voice level. "Officer, I am a federal judge. Here is my identification." He held out his federal ID card. The officer looked at the card briefly, then smirked. "This? Anyone can print this on a computer. Don't try to fool me." He tossed the card back at David, letting it fall to the ground. David's eyes followed the card as it landed near his shoe. He did not bend to pick it up. He stayed still, his breathing steady, though inside he felt a rising wave of disbelief. The quiet neighborhood street had grown even quieter. A few people on porches had noticed the flashing lights and were beginning to watch. The younger officer looked uncertain for a moment. He glanced at the ID on the ground but said nothing. The lead officer, however, seemed fueled by something stronger than doubt. He stepped closer, his face hard. "You think you can lie your way out of this?" he said, his voice low but filled with anger. His hand gripped his holster tighter. David remained calm. "I am telling you the truth. Please check my credentials. You will see who I am." The officer's lips curled. "Save it. People like you always have some story." The word stung with a weight David recognized too well. He had seen bias in his courtroom before. He had ruled on cases where prejudice destroyed lives. But to feel it now directed at him so openly was something different. He stood silently, refusing to lower himself into argument. His dignity would not be taken. The tension grew heavier with each second. The lead officer suddenly drew his weapon, pointing it directly at David's chest. The neighborhood gasped. A woman across the street screamed. A man pulled out his phone and began recording. The younger officer's eyes widened, but he still said nothing. Frozen between fear and loyalty, David did not move. He had faced lawyers who shouted, criminals who threatened, and cases that tested the very foundation of justice. But standing before a drawn gun in the hands of the law itself was unlike anything else. He did not flinch. His voice stayed steady. "Officer, lower your weapon. This is not the way." The officer sneered, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. "One more word and you'll regret it." David stood firm. His silence now was louder than any argument. His calmness, his refusal to show fear, unsettled the officer more than any outburst could have. The quiet street was filled with the sound of people whispering, phones clicking, and hearts beating fast. Inside, David knew something important. This moment was not just about him. It was about what the badge stood for, what justice meant, and what the world would soon see. He could feel the weight of the story unfolding, the presence of witnesses, and the certainty that the truth would not stay hidden, though the gun pointed at him was real. He believed something greater was also real: justice, patience, and truth. The lights from the police car painted the scene in red and blue, flashing across David's calm face and the trembling hands of the officer. The evening air was heavy with fear, but also with a strange kind of strength. The first part of a story much larger than any one man had begun, and those who watched would remember it for the rest of their lives. The street had fallen into an uneasy silence, broken only by the flashing lights of the police car and the whispers of bystanders who had begun to gather. Judge David Turner stood calmly beside his vehicle, his eyes fixed on the officer pointing a gun at him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, but he would not allow fear to show on his face. His years on the bench had taught him the importance of composure, even in the most unpredictable situations. Yet deep inside he understood that this was not just another case. This was his own life being held in the balance, and prejudice had taken control of the night. The lead officer's voice rang out, sharp and hostile. "Don't move a muscle." His finger hovered near the trigger, his posture tense and unyielding. David did not move, but he spoke in his calm, steady tone. "Officer, I have identified myself. I am a federal judge. My identification is genuine. Please verify it properly." His words carried neither anger nor panic, only the truth, but the officer's face twisted with disbelief and stubbornness. He gave a mocking laugh. "A judge? In these clothes? Driving a car like this? Do you really expect me to believe that?" The words struck David like a reminder of the bias he had seen countless times in his courtroom. He had presided over cases where people were judged by their appearance rather than their character. Now he was experiencing the same prejudice firsthand. He knew the officer did not see him as a man of law and integrity. He saw only what he wanted to see, and his own prejudice blinded him to the truth. The younger officer shifted uneasily beside his partner. His hand rested nervously on his belt, but his eyes told a different story. He was not as sheer, not as hardened. His gaze flicked between David's calm demeanor and his partner's aggressive stance. For a brief moment it seemed as if he wanted to speak, to question the situation, but he remained silent. The authority of the senior officer held him back, and silence became his shield. The small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk began murmuring louder. Several had taken out their phones, recording the tense standoff. One man shouted, "He showed you his ID!" "Why are you treating him like this?" Another voice rose. "Put the gun down! He's not a threat!" But the officer ignored them, his focus locked entirely on David, as if the world around them did not exist. David stood tall, every inch of his posture radiating dignity. "You are making a mistake," he said evenly. "I am who I claim to be. You will regret ignoring the truth." The officer's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the weapon. "Don't threaten me," he spat. "You people always think you can talk your way out of trouble." The bitterness in his tone revealed not only suspicion, but also prejudice deeply rooted in his view of the world. David knew then that this was more than just arrogance. This was a reflection of bias, a dangerous mix of pride and discrimination. The younger officer finally spoke, his voice cautious. Maybe we should call it in, check his ID with headquarters. His words were reasonable, but the lead officer snapped back instantly. No need, I know when someone's lying. He thinks he's clever, but he's not fooling me. The younger man fell silent again, his attempt at reason crushed by his partner's authority. The hesitation in his eyes, however, did not go unnoticed by David. The weight of the gun remained steady, but David refused to let fear dictate his actions. His voice remained calm, almost soothing, as he said, "Officer, you hold a weapon meant to protect, not to intimidate. I am standing here unarmed, cooperating fully. Please check my credentials. That is all I ask." His words carried a quiet strength that unsettled the officer, though the man hid it behind a mask of defiance. From across the street, a woman raised her voice. "He's telling the truth. I've seen him on the news before. That's Judge Turner." Her voice cut through the night, and a ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Some nodded. Others whispered among themselves, confirming they had indeed seen the judge's face on television during important trials. The atmosphere shifted. What had begun as a simple abuse of power was now turning into a public spectacle. The officer's authority was cracking under the eyes of the community, yet his pride would not allow him to step back. David could feel the shift too. The power of truth was beginning to weigh against the false assumptions made by the officer. He stood taller, his calm presence growing stronger with each passing second. "You see, officer," he said quietly, "the people know me. They know who I am. And soon the whole world will know what you have done here tonight." The officer's face reddened with anger. He pressed the gun closer, his frustration boiling over. "Enough," he barked. "One more word and—" But even as his threat hung in the air, the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Blue and red lights approached from another street, cutting closer with each passing second. The younger officer turned his head, surprise flashing in his eyes. The lead officer clenched his jaw but did not lower his weapon. The crowd grew louder, their voices rising with both fear and defiance. Phones continued recording, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. David remained motionless, his gaze steady. The sirens drew nearer, their wail filling the air. He knew reinforcements were coming, though he did not yet know who they were. What he did know was that this moment was no longer hidden. The truth was out in the open, and the gun pointed at him was not just aimed at one man, it was aimed at justice itself. The tension reached its peak. The officer's pride battled against reason, his grip tight, his face rigid. The younger officer stood caught in the middle, his conscience pulling him one way, his loyalty the other. The crowd stood united, their voices echoing across the street, demanding fairness, demanding decency. And Judge David Turner, unshaken and unbroken, stood as the silent center of it all, a man of law facing the law's darkest shadow. The seconds felt like hours. Each breath was measured, each movement deliberate. But even in that storm of hostility, David held on to the quiet certainty that truth would prevail. The night was far from over. The confrontation had only just begun, and what followed would change the course of not only his life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, bouncing off the buildings and echoing through the street. The flashing red and blue lights already painted the scene, but now new lights joined in, brighter, stronger, and far more commanding. The lead officer holding the gun at Judge David Turner stiffened, his eyes darting toward the sound. The younger officer stepped back nervously, glancing between his partner, the crowd, and the approaching vehicles. The air was charged with tension, like a storm just before lightning strikes. Everyone watching knew something big was about to happen. David remained still, his breathing steady, his eyes calm. He could sense that the balance of the night was shifting. He had lived long enough to recognize the signs. He had seen countless dramatic moments in the courtroom when truth finally broke through the lies. This moment carried the same weight. He did not know exactly who was coming, but he felt certain that help was near. The sirens stopped abruptly as several black SUVs rolled onto the street. Their doors opened quickly, and armed federal marshals poured out in disciplined formation. Their presence was different from local police. They moved with precision, their uniforms marked clearly, their authority radiating strength. They knew exactly who they had come for, and their eyes fixed immediately on the scene where David stood, facing a drawn gun. "Drop the weapon," one marshal commanded firmly, his voice sharp and commanding. The crowd gasped as the marshals raised their weapons, aiming directly at the local officer who still held his gun against David. The young officer froze completely, his hand leaving his belt as he raised both palms to show he was unarmed. The lead officer, however, hesitated, his pride and anger clouding his judgment. His weapon remained pointed, his eyes locked on David, as if he refused to accept the reality that was unfolding before him. Judge Turner did not move. He stood calmly between the two forces, his composure unshaken. He spoke in a clear voice that carried over the noise of the crowd and the heavy breathing of the officers. "Federal Judge David Turner," he announced firmly, his voice steady like a gavel striking wood. "I am under the protection of the United States Marshal Service. You are pointing your weapon at a sitting federal judge. This is your last warning." The words hit like thunder. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Phones captured every second. The marshals tightened their stance, their fingers ready, but their eyes on their target. The lead officer's face twisted, sweat forming on his brow. For a moment he looked as if he might continue, as if his pride would push him to make the biggest mistake of his life. But under the weight of the judge's calm authority and the marshal's overwhelming presence, his defiance cracked. With a shaky exhale, he slowly lowered his weapon, his hand trembling as it finally left the trigger. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the sound of people's hearts pounding. "On the ground," the marshal barked. In seconds, the lead officer was tackled, disarmed, and placed in handcuffs. The younger officer raised his hands higher, showing no resistance as two marshals restrained him as well. The crowd erupted in cheers, clapping and shouting in support of the judge. Some called out his name. Others shouted for justice. The once quiet neighborhood street had become the stage for a dramatic revelation. David finally bent down and picked up his federal ID card from the ground. He held it up for the crowd to see, his calm voice carrying once again. "The truth is always stronger than lies," he said. His words were simple, but they struck deep. Cameras flashed. Phones streamed live. Within minutes, the videos of the event began spreading across the internet, racing through social media like wildfire. What had started as an abuse of power by two officers was now a national story unfolding in real time. The marshals escorted David toward the SUVs, but he stopped for a moment and turned back to face the crowd. He did not want to leave without acknowledging them. "Thank you for standing as witnesses," he said gently. "Your voices matter. Never forget that." The people cheered louder, their respect for the judge growing with each word. They had seen his courage, his calmness in the face of danger, and they knew they had witnessed something historic. Inside the SUV, David finally allowed himself a long breath. The adrenaline that had fueled his composure began to ease, but his mind remained sharp. He knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a storm that would shake the very foundations of law enforcement in the city. The images of an officer pointing a gun at a federal judge, ignoring identification, and dismissing truth because of prejudice were now recorded forever. The nation would demand answers, and he would ensure they received them. Meanwhile, back on the street, the lead officer shouted angrily, even in handcuffs, insisting he had done nothing wrong, claiming he had been tricked. His words fell flat against the undeniable truth captured by dozens of cameras. The younger officer remained silent, his face pale, his eyes downcast. He knew the world would see his silence, his failure to stop his partner, and he felt the weight of guilt pressing down on him. The marshals filed reports immediately, collecting statements from bystanders and securing the video evidence. Every detail mattered now. The judge's safety was their top priority, but they also understood that this case would go beyond one night. It would reach the highest levels of government and law, and it would expose the deep flaws that allowed such behavior to happen. Back in his seat, David closed his eyes for a moment, replaying the events in his mind. He remembered the officer's words, the prejudice in his tone, the stubborn refusal to accept the truth. He thought of all the people in his courtroom who had faced similar treatment, but without witnesses or protection. His heart ached for them, but it also grew stronger with resolve. This time, justice would not be ignored. This time, the truth had been seen by all. The SUVs pulled away from the neighborhood, the marshals ensuring no one followed too closely. The flashing lights faded into the distance, but the memory of what had happened burned brightly in the minds of everyone who had been there. The crowd remained buzzing with conversation, their voices filled with disbelief, anger, and admiration for the judge who had stood so tall under the threat of a gun. Within hours, news channels broadcast the story. Headlines lit up across television screens and phone alerts. Local police point gun at federal judge. Marshals intervene in shocking abuse of power. Judge's calm courage goes viral. Across the country, people watched the video clips, their hearts pounding as they saw the gun raised, the judge standing firm and the marshals rushing in. The story spread like fire, igniting conversations in homes, offices, and government halls. David watched the reports quietly from a secure location. He knew the attention would be overwhelming, but he also knew it was necessary. Change often required a spark, and tonight that spark had been lit. He would not let the moment fade. He would use it to shine a light on the prejudice and abuse hidden behind badges that were meant to protect. His resolve was firm, his spirit unbroken. The bitter truth had been revealed, and now the path to justice had begun. The following morning, the entire city woke up to the sound of one story. On every news channel, in every newspaper, and across every corner of social media, the shocking images from the night before played again and again. The video of a police officer pointing his gun at a calm, unarmed man, who turned out to be a federal judge, was everywhere. People could not stop talking about it. The disbelief was written on every face. How could someone sworn to protect the law dare to threaten a judge of the law itself? Judge David Turner sat quietly in his office, reviewing the events with a clear but heavy mind. His chambers felt different that day. Usually, the halls of the courthouse carried a quiet sense of order, but now they buzzed with whispers, staff rushing back and forth with updates about media requests and government inquiries. For David, the courtroom had always been a place of dignity, but he knew that dignity had been insulted in the worst way possible. Now the law itself demanded a response. A special investigation was ordered immediately. The Justice Department sent officials into the city to oversee the matter. The 2 officers involved were suspended on the spot. Their guns and badges were taken away, and they were placed under heavy questioning. The younger officer sat quietly in interviews, his voice soft and hesitant, finally admitting that he had doubts about what happened but had been afraid to challenge his partner. His silence the night before now weighed against him, but his honesty in the aftermath gave investigators a clearer picture of the truth. The lead officer, however, refused to admit any wrongdoing. He insisted he had acted with caution and denied that prejudice had guided his actions. His words, however, could not erase the videos and the voices of the crowd. The courtroom where Judge Turner presided became the heart of the storm. For years he had guided cases with fairness, but now he found himself at the center of one. His position demanded that he step back and allow others to judge, but his sense of responsibility told him otherwise. He believed strongly that this case was not just about 2 officers. It was about the system that allowed them to act without fear, the arrogance that made them ignore identification, and the prejudice that made them believe they could not be questioned. He told himself that the law had to shine brightest when tested in darkness. The first hearing drew massive attention. People lined up outside the courthouse long before the session began. Protesters held signs calling for justice, police reform, and accountability. Others simply stood silently, waiting to see what would happen. Inside, the courtroom filled with reporters, officials, and citizens who wanted to witness history. When Judge Turner entered, the room fell silent. He was not wearing his robe at first. He walked in slowly, carrying the same calm dignity he had shown on the street that night. His presence alone reminded everyone why they were there. Then, as he stepped to his chair, he put on his robe, a symbol of the law that even the strongest prejudice could not strip away. The case began with evidence. The video recordings were shown on the large screens, replaying the moment when the gun was drawn, the words spoken, and the truth ignored. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy as everyone watched. The officer's mocking voice echoed, his disbelief in the judge's ID repeating like an unforgettable scar. The crowd's shouts, the woman's recognition, and finally the marshal's arrival, all of it unfolded like a drama no one could deny. The truth was clear, undeniable, and painful. The defense tried to argue that the officers had been cautious, that the situation had been uncertain, but every time they spoke, the video stood as silent but powerful witnesses. The judge's calm, the officer's arrogance, the bystanders' voices, all proved that this was not caution but misconduct. This was not doubt but prejudice. The younger officer's testimony confirmed it further. He admitted his partner dismissed the ID without reason, that his own suggestion to check it properly had been rejected. His honesty hurt his career but saved his conscience. As the days passed, the hearings continued. Experts testified about law enforcement standards, about how officers are trained to verify credentials, not to dismiss them. Civil rights leaders spoke about the dangers of unchecked power, reminding everyone that what happened to Judge Turner could happen to anyone without protection. The weight of the case grew heavier, not just for the city but for the entire nation watching. It was no longer just about two officers. It was about accountability, equality, and the future of policing. Through it all, Judge Turner spoke carefully. He gave interviews when required, never once raising his voice or showing anger. Instead, he reminded the people of what mattered most. The law was meant to protect, not to harm. He said justice is not just for the powerful. It is for the ordinary citizen walking the street. If it fails them, then it fails us all. His words struck deep into the hearts of the people. Protesters carried them on banners. Students quoted them in classrooms, and leaders repeated them in speeches. The police department, under heavy pressure, faced its own reckoning. Officials resigned, leaders were replaced, and new rules were proposed. Body cameras would be monitored more strictly, complaints would be reviewed more openly, and officers would be trained again on the responsibilities of their badge. For many, these changes felt late, but they were necessary. The city could not ignore the shame of what had happened. The courtroom atmosphere remained intense. Every day brought new crowds, new voices demanding accountability. Some cried when they watched the videos, some grew angry, and some simply sat in silence. But all of them understood that history was being written before their eyes. The nation's highest officials spoke about the case, promising that it would mark a turning point. The president himself called Judge Turner to express support, telling him that his courage had reminded the country of what true strength looked like. Inside himself, David felt the weight of both pain and hope. He had faced humiliation on the street, but he had faced it with calm and dignity. Now that calmness was helping to heal others. People who had long lost faith in justice began to believe again, not because the system was perfect, but because someone had shown that truth could still prevail. He reminded himself each day that his role was not for personal pride but for something larger. This case was about the law itself, about ensuring that no one ever felt powerless in front of authority. By the end of the hearings, it was clear the officers would face serious consequences. Their words and actions had already condemned them in the eyes of the people. But Judge Turner was not focused only on punishment. He wanted change. He wanted to ensure that future officers would understand that their duty was service, not dominance. That their badge was a shield for the weak, not a weapon for the arrogant. His speeches carried this message again and again, until it became the heart of the story itself. When he returned to his chambers each evening, he often sat alone for a few moments thinking of the people who had stood on that sidewalk, recording, shouting, refusing to be silent. Without them, the truth might never have been believed. He felt grateful for their courage, and he promised himself he would never stop being a voice for those who did not always have one. The bitter night when a gun was pointed at him had become a spark for something larger. The courtroom was not only a place for trials now. It had become the place where a nation searched for its conscience. The final day of the trial arrived like the closing chapter of a long, heavy book. The courthouse was surrounded by people. Crowds stretched across the steps holding signs, chanting and waiting for the verdict that would decide not only the fate of two officers, but also the faith of many in the justice system. Reporters filled every corner, their cameras ready, their microphones raised. Everyone knew this was more than just another case. It had become a symbol, a moment that would define how the law responded to those who abused it. Judge David Turner sat quietly in his chambers before stepping into the courtroom. He wore his robe, freshly pressed, the black fabric a reminder of the responsibility it carried. For weeks he had watched and listened as evidence piled up, as voices from the community rose, and as the truth unfolded for all to see. He had seen pain in the eyes of citizens who testified about their own experiences. He had seen anger in the faces of protesters who demanded change. But he had also seen hope that this time the system would not turn away. The doors to the courtroom opened and Judge Turner entered. A hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that carries both fear and anticipation. The jury sat ready, their expressions serious, aware of the weight of their decision. The two officers sat at the defense table, their futures hanging by a thread. The younger one looked pale, his eyes downcast, knowing his silence on the street that night would forever define him. The older one, the lead officer, kept his jaw clenched, his pride still battling against the truth, though the evidence against him was overwhelming. The foreman of the jury stood and read the verdict. The words echoed like thunder in the chamber. Guilty on charges of misconduct, abuse of authority, and unlawful threat under color of law. Guilty on charges of ignoring lawful identification and endangering a federal judge. The verdict struck the room with finality. The younger officer closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his guilt had finally crushed him. The lead officer shouted in protest, claiming the system was against him, but his words were drowned out by the voices of the people outside. Justice had spoken. The sentencing followed swiftly. The younger officer received a lighter punishment, his honesty during the investigation sparing him from the harshest penalty, though his career was finished forever. The lead officer faced the full weight of the law. His badge was stripped, his years of arrogance erased in a single moment. He would no longer walk the streets with authority. His actions had destroyed his name, his career, and his freedom. It was the bitter end he had brought upon himself. Outside, the crowds erupted in cheers. Some cried, some hugged strangers, and some simply stood with relief on their faces. For many, it was the first time they had seen true accountability against those who misused the badge. The courthouse steps became a place of celebration, not for revenge but for justice. People carried signs that read, "Justice wins and truth cannot be silenced." The story that had begun with fear on a quiet street ended with hope on the courthouse steps. Judge Turner stepped outside after the session, escorted by marshals, but he raised his hand gently to stop them from rushing him into a car. He wanted to face the people. He walked to the top of the courthouse steps and looked out at the sea of faces, thousands of them, filled with energy and hope. Cameras flashed, chants grew louder, but when he raised his hand, the crowd fell silent. His voice carried across the plaza, steady and clear. "Last month I stood on a street with a gun pointed at me. That night was not just about me. It was about what happens when prejudice replaces duty, when arrogance replaces service. But tonight we have seen that the law is still stronger than hate. This verdict is not just justice for one man. It is a message to every citizen that no one is above the law and no one is beneath its protection." The crowd roared with applause. His words echoed through the air, reaching not only those present but millions watching on television and online. People felt the truth in his voice, the steady conviction of a man who had faced fear without breaking, and who now stood as proof that dignity could defeat hatred. In the days that followed, the effects spread far beyond the city. Departments across the country began reviewing their policies, fearing the same shame would fall upon them if they ignored reform. Leaders announced stricter rules, mandatory training, and transparent accountability measures. The case became a textbook example in law schools, studied by future lawyers and judges as a turning point. What had once been just another abuse of power was now a landmark in the fight for fairness. Judge Turner returned to his regular duties, but life was not the same. Wherever he went, people recognized him. Strangers stopped him to thank him for his courage. Letters poured into his office, some from citizens he had never met, some from families who had faced injustice but now felt hope again. He read every letter, grateful for the connection, but he never allowed the attention to inflate his pride. He reminded himself each morning that he was not a hero, but simply a servant of the law doing his duty. One evening, after another long day at court, he returned to the same quiet street where it all began. He parked his car under the soft glow of a street lamp and stepped out, looking around at the houses and porches. Life had returned to normal there, but he could still feel the memory of that night in the air. He could still hear the officer's voice, still see the flash of the gun, and still feel the weight of his own calm refusal to bend. Yet this time he felt peace. The bitter moment had ended and something greater had grown from it. As he stood there, a man from one of the houses walked over and shook his hand. "Judge Turner," the man said softly, "thank you. You didn't just stand for yourself that night. You stood for all of us." David smiled gently, his eyes warm but humble. "It was the truth that stood," he replied. "I only refused to step away from it." The man nodded, and together they looked at the street that had witnessed both fear and justice. It was quiet again, but the silence now carried dignity instead of tension. The memory would remain, but so would the lesson. The law had spoken, the people had stood, and the bitter end of arrogance had become the bright beginning of reform. In the years to come, the story would be told again and again. Children would learn about the judge who stood calmly against a gun. Communities would remind themselves of the power of truth, and officers would be trained with the reminder that their badge was a responsibility, not a shield for pride. And through it all, Judge Turner would continue his work, steady and calm, never letting one night define him, but always letting it guide him. The night of fear had ended in justice. The bitter end of police arrogance had become a lesson for the nation, and in the quiet heart of the city, a judge walked forward with the same dignity that had carried him through it all, knowing that the true strength of justice is not in punishment, but in the unwavering belief that truth will always prevail.